Several of you had trouble understanding the logic behind the activity TAP 2.1, which is exercising a conceptual understanding of how we use the concept of internal rates of return across career paths that require similarly able, in this case similarly high-skilled individuals. The long-run equilibrium condition across markets for labor markets that in professions that require similar skill level, similar aptitudes, is that internal rates of return to these endeavors should be equal. And if this were not the case, again, it's a very long run phenomenon. If internal rates of return were not equalized and we had relatively free movement among different sectors, over time, individuals would be less likely to enter, or they might leave as well, the relatively low returning sectors, and they would move to the relatively high returning sectors. Well, in that process, as people leave the low returning sectors or don't enter, the returns in those sectors are driven up, and as people enter the relatively high paying sectors, well, because of this increase in supply, the returns in those sectors are driven down. So that's the idea of it. Thought of an analogy. Think about the supermarket checkout system. Of course, that's a short run. We're talking about in labor markets, very, very long run trends. But just think about the supermarket checkout. When you roll your cart full of groceries up to the checkout line, you know, all the lines tend to be pretty much about the same. And there's a reason for that, right? If there were one line that were offering really speedy checkout and the other lines were long, well, people would go into the short line, and people would leave the long lines and go into the short lines. And when does this process stop? Only when the estimated wait by glancing at all the lines is about equal. Now watch out, if I'm ever in a line, don't go in that line, because I am cursed. The line will stop. There'll be the old lady that can't find her checkbook in front of me every time. But at least when we talk about expected wait times, those tend to be equalized by this process. The labor market process happens over many, many years' time, but the logic is somewhat similar. I can talk you through an example, simplifying. Let's suppose that instead of internal rates of return, we're just talking about wage rates, and let's forget about the dimension of the problem that requires years and years of training. But let's say we had this labor market for physicians, and then we had this labor market, labor on the x-axis, wage on the y-axis for lawyers. Well, this equilibrium condition simply states, and again, that's supposed to be a D. That's not much of a D, is it? This equilibrium condition simply states that, you know, in a long-run equilibrium, if nobody's going to be switching out of one sector and into another, we tend to see these labor markets clear. That was supposed to be intersecting at that proper wage rate. All right. There we go. That's a little bit better. Anyway, over time, we'd expect to see something like this situation where wages in both sectors were roughly equal. And again, I'm abstracting away from the training requirements that because of the time dimension, we use internal rates of return instead of just wages, but the logic is similar. All right, well, let's suppose that something happens in the economy, just to illustrate this point. Let's suppose that computers come to replace lawyers in the U.S. economy. And so It used to take people to process insurance claims. Now computers can do it quickly. So there's less demand for lawyers. So let's say this is a short run demand shift. I'm not sure it was computers, but we did experience 5 or 10 years ago a somewhat abrupt decline. It was before the Great Recession, decline in the demand for lawyers. Anyway, so in this short window, there's all these people that have been trained for lawyers and trained as lawyers. They don't have much options. But as bright young people are going through college and deciding on careers, they look, oh man, law, it used to be a good way to make a living, but now it stinks. What are we going to do elsewhere? What are we going to do otherwise? Well, they end up going elsewhere. So in the very, very long run, what we see tends to happen, I'm going to use green, is that in the long run, people stop going to be lawyers. And some people might even leave law and train to be something else. And what we see over time is this demand event in the short run, because of the wage discrepancy between law and everything else that bright people could do. We see this exit in law. Well, one of the sectors that people could go to is physicians. Again, this is as bright people make their career decisions. We're talking about a years-long adjustment process. So the long-run dynamics, I'm having trouble with my stylus, the long-run dynamics would have people exit law and enter other sectors, including physician services. Again, a very long-run process, but again, in the long run, we'd expect this dynamic to lead to roughly equal wages, and in our case, equal internal rates of return. So this is what we expect, and we see this across a lot of skill categories, a lot of very different but high skill categories: engineering, masters in business administration, law, but we don't see it in physicians. And the question is why? And that's what this tap has to do with. Well, what could halt this process of adjustment? That's supposed to be a question mark. Well, if we think about the market for physicians again, and again, I know I'm making some dramatic simplifications here. If, for whatever reason, that ability to adjust to these events by entering physician markets were curtailed, well then the story I just told about law wouldn't hold, because people would want to go leave law, but if there were barriers to entry, they couldn't go become a physician. So this is a physician labor market. So what on that list, remember that list, what on that list could explain some barrier to entry that just would leave the labor supply very inelastic and not shifting to the right in any way, even over time? Well, first and foremost, the AMA has been very, very successful in restricting the number of seats in American med schools. And, there's plenty of good med schools elsewhere. So if you can't get into a U.S. med school, you could go to a German med school or a British med school or, wherever, Canadian med school or, for a while, Jamaican med school, whatever. They have the same texts, they have expert teachers, just go there. Well, guess what? The American Medical Association has succeeded in putting severe barriers on people entering the U.S. market as physicians. Even when their training's been excellent, they can pass all the tests. It's just the Physicians Union, the American Medical Association, has simply said no to that. And there's some political sympathy, right? We don't want hacks operating on us or our relatives. But we seem to have gone way past the level of protection that just keeps hacks out. Now we're keeping just fantastically able people out. Both we're keeping fantastically able people from entering med school. We're keeping fantastically able people from entering the country as physicians. And it's estimated that 25% of the very high earnings that are still commanded by physicians, 25% of these earnings result from these restrictions on entry. So we talked about restrictions on domestic training, restrictions on immigration, and it's possible that there's simply a shortage of people in the world that would tolerate the long hours and responsibility that physicians are required to take on. Or maybe it requires a level of smarts, so there just simply aren't enough people with high enough IQs, whatever. That could also amount to a barrier to entry that would just keep supply fixed. In fact, there's very little evidence. You look at the people getting denied entry into the country, denied entry into med school, and there's some fantastically able people. It's gotten very ridiculous on who's turned away from med school these days. Notice that the story that there isn't a story you could tell where the high worth of physicians, the importance of the job they do to society would result in these high pay rates that even if it's a very worthy sector, if the returns were so high, there'd be people that would be interested in entering, and in so doing would drive down wages. And indeed, we see that very important sectors, social work, teaching, all sorts of jobs that have... Social work seems to attract people because of its intrinsic meaning. You're helping people, and there's a lot of people that want meaning in their job. My wife is one of them. She used to manage residential care facilities, and I'd say, Lisa, if you were doing the same stuff at Intel, you'd be making $200,000 a year, and I could just sit at home eating bonbons on the couch. And she said, yeah, but I couldn't get up and do that job just to make computer chips. It's helping people that motivates me. And teaching, you get to do this great job. You're often on a 9-month contract, so you're off when your kids are off. There's a lot of lifestyle benefits that result in this. A lot of people entering and driving down wages. And yeah, it's not that it's an unimportant sector. It's just that people entering the field don't care, or in fact, the high worth of the activity might even accelerate the process. There's nothing about compensation that would be necessarily tied to your positive social value. That's not the way markets work. Maybe it should work that way. That's a moral question. But the way we actually see markets work, that's not how it goes.